What's up everybody, it's Rafi at ZURB. I'm just over here crushing this layout with the new Foundation XY grid. Now, this is part 4 of our series on Flexbox. Last week we talked about Flexbox properties and all kinds of other helpers. So if you missed that, go ahead and check it out in the link above. Now this week we're going to talk about the all new XY grid. It's an amazing new grid. There's nothing else out there like it, and you're going to get to learn how to use it. So we're going to show you how to use the vertical and horizontal positioning of the XY grid, also how to do auto and shrink sizing, and also combining these with a lot of Foundation's helper classes for positioning. So there's a lot of really cool stuff. Let's check it out. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to show you how you can get the brand new XY grid, which is part of Foundation 6.4. So if we go over to the Foundation website, foundation.zurb.com, and we hit download, you can actually download the CSS version right from here. So if we hit download everything, you will get 6.4 with the brand new XY grid. So if you want to customize Foundation, you can scroll down a little bit and we can use the customizer here. XY grid is the default. If we want one of the older grids, the legacy grids, if you want to still continue using the Flex grid because you know that well, or the float grid for older browsers, you can definitely choose that in the customizer. So once you do that, you can get your custom version. Another way to get the XY grid is to create a brand new SAS project. So if you're using Foundation's SAS version, it's already going to come with the XY grid enabled in 6.4. Now if you're upgrading, then you can select to use the XY grid as well. Now I'm going to actually show you in a project where you can turn that on and off just real quick, just so you know where that is in case you want to change it. So if we take a look here at our app.scss file, we can see that the includes have Foundation XY grid classes. So this is your XY grid. It's enabled by default. If we want to disable that and then enable, let's say, the Flex grid, we can definitely do that. Now, interestingly, you can have both of these grids enabled at the same time, and that's because they don't share the same classes. The XY grid uses brand new classes. So if you're porting this over and you want to slowly port this over and not run into any major issues, you can have both grids enabled at the same time. So that is the legacy, one of the legacy grids, and the new XY grid can be included at the same time. But we want it to look like this because we're going to go into the XY grid. So let's jump right into how the XY grid works. All right. So I set up a code pen, and you're going to see some colors here, which I'm going to explain for the grid cells. So traditionally in the legacy grids and most other grids, you might have some kind of row and column relationship. So in earlier versions of Foundation and also in the legacy versions that you can still use, the row is your container for your columns. So you see here we have row set up with 2 columns inside. So the columns would be your containers for your content. So in the XY grid, the syntax has changed a bit. So we're going to show you what the new syntax is and how they correspond to the old classes. So instead of row, we're going to use grid X. And then we're going to use cells instead of column. So that's the basics of it to switch over to the new XY grid. So grid X denotes I want to create a grid container in the horizontal direction. And then your cells are your containers for your content. Now in the new XY grid, there is no spacing by default on the cells. So that is something that you can explicitly set, and I'll show you how to do that in just a little bit. But the basic setup is here we have 2 cells. They don't have any sizing on them, so they're just going to stack on top of each other. So we can actually explicitly size these cells, or we can also implicitly size them using Flexbox, which I'll show you here as well. Now Foundation has a bunch of responsive sizing classes. And to really understand that, you'd have to understand some of the breakpoints. So let's explain how these sizing classes work. So I want to size these cells. So I'm going to say small dash 6. So if I add a class of small dash 6 here and then a class of small dash 6 on the second cell, you can see that now we have two cells that sit side by side, and they're both 50% of the width of the grid X. So grid X again is your container for your cells, and your cells are your containers for your content. So because Foundation is using a 12 cell grid, you actually have 12 cells to split between the horizontal width of grid X. So if we say small 6 and small 6, that means we're using 50% width for each of the cells. So you can see here that it's split evenly 50%. Now we can actually change that to be, let's say, small 4 and then small 8. So if we do that, we still add up to 12 total cells, but now the first cell on the left is a little bit smaller than the cell on the right. Okay. Now, the small in front of that just means that this is the size that we want it to be on the small breakpoint and larger. So that means you can actually use different sizing classes on different breakpoints. So this is the small breakpoint, and Foundation is mobile first, so if you set small to be something, unless you override it, that means it's going to apply to the larger breakpoints as well. But we are going to override it. So let's say on small, I want this to actually be 12 columns, because 12 is full width, and we want these two cells to stack on top of each other. So here we have two cells stacked on top of each other for small and larger screens. So now I'm going to override that. I'm going to say medium dash 6 and medium dash 6. So we're still adding up to 12, but now you can see that on medium and larger, we're going to be split 50% width for each of these, which is 6 cells wide for each. Now if I shrink this down to a smaller screen, you can see that they're going to stack together on top of each other on a small screen. That's because they're set to small 12. Now 12 means full width. So I want this cell to take up full width. That forces the next cell next to it to stack down below it. And we can continue up to the large breakpoint. So small, medium, and large are enabled by default. You can also enable extra large and extra large in your CSS or in your SAS version. It's even easier with just a quick setting. So let's do large dash 4 and large dash 8. So still adding up to 12. You can see that now on a large screen we have the first cell is 4 wide, and then the second cell is 8 wide. When we get down to a medium screen, you can see now that it shifts to be medium 6 and medium 6, so splitting that width 50%, and then stacks on top of each other for small. So that's how you can use Foundation's responsive sizing classes. Now, everything is touching up against each other, and so we might want to create some spacing between these cells, especially if we have more cells or if there's certain content in here that we don't want touching each other. So Foundation actually has some margin or padding classes that you can add to your grid. Now this is really important. So before and in earlier versions of the Foundation grid, in pretty much every other grid out there, you can only use padding. Now Foundation is taking advantage of some of the latest features in CSS, and we're actually able to use a margin-based grid, which is really powerful. Margin creates real spacing. So I'm going to hop in and add it starts with grid, so grid dash margin, and then we're going to go in the X direction, so that's horizontally again. So what I just did was create some grid margin in between my cells. So notice I set this at the parent level on the grid X. So I can control the margin between my cells at the parent level with just one single class. So I did grid margin X, and that's going to create, again, horizontal spacing on the outer edges of my grid. Now I can also do grid padding X instead if I want padding. So the difference is that margin is actually spacing on the outside of containers, where padding is spacing on the inside of containers. There might be different reasons that you'll use either one, and that's why both options are available. In general, margin-based spacing is the best. But there might be some times where you have certain background images or something else that you might want padding instead. As you can see, it allows the cells to still butt up against each other, but now the spacing, this pink area that you're seeing here, is the actual spacing created between the cells. So if my content actually butted up against the edge, it wouldn't touch the content of the cell next to it. So there you go, grid padding X, grid padding, or grid margin X. So we're gonna use margin. And you can see another feature of using margin is that you still have a full width grid or a fluid width grid. Now you might actually want to constrain this grid into something a little bit smaller. Let's say you want to give your grid a maximum width and you want it centered inside the page. That's pretty common. So by default, if you use the grid X without any kind of container, then you're going to be fluid width, which is really nice. You don't have to explicitly set anything to do that. So let's go ahead and cut all this out. We're going to wrap our grid in a grid container. So the grid container will actually give your grids a maximum width and also center them inside of your page. So here we go. I just put my grid X back into the grid container. Now it's inside of a grid container. So you can see that it is actually constrained now inside of a max width. So the default max width of the Foundation grid container is 1200 pixels. And you can change that in your CSS, or if you're using the SAS version, your settings file is a lot easier. So we're going to go ahead and continue using this grid container. So you can see that now it's not touching the edges. The gray spacing here is the edges of your grid X, and that's the background of the grid X. I just added that so you can see that the margin spacing is creating that outer spacing there, so your cells are not touching the outer edge of the grid X, which is probably the way that you'd want it. So another thing you can do is do grid container padded. So what this class does is ensure that you have some padding, so when you get down below the maximum width that the grid container creates, you still have that natural spacing on the edges. So you can see that this gray area here represents some spacing away from the edges of your page, so that way you don't have your cells butting up against the edge of the page again, looking flush. That wouldn't look right in most cases. So you can explicitly control that with the grid container padded class on the grid container. Cool. So we've seen how to do explicit sizing, especially in a responsive environment, and you can mix and match these classes as needed with as many cells as you need. So another cool thing you can do is auto and shrink sizing with your cells. So we've set some explicit sizing to these cells, but let's actually change it up so we can use auto and shrink sizing. So I'm going to remove the explicit sizing that we used on the cells here, and I'm going to set the first one to shrink. I'm going to set the second one to auto. So these are just modifier classes that you can add to your cells, and now they're going to change the behavior of the cells automatically. Now Flexbox allows you to do this, and this XY grid is based on Flexbox. So here we go. We have shrink and auto. So basically what shrink does is it takes up the amount of space that's needed for the content in the container. So since the word cell is pretty small and there's no additional padding on that particular cell, it's only going to take up the amount of spacing of that text. Now, if there was some padding in that cell, it would expand just a little bit. And we can actually show you what that looks like. Grid padding X. So there you go. I've added some padding. You can see that the cell that's set to shrink actually got a little bit bigger because, again, padding is spacing on the inside. So that's how the shrink will work. So you can use shrink for a lot of different things. So let me add some text in here. And you can see that as the content inside of the shrink cell gets bigger, the shrink cell also gets bigger. And then the cell on the other side that has auto set to it will just shrink down to take up the remaining space. So that's the really powerful, easy to use stuff that Flexbox allows you to do, and the XY grid has built-in classes to take advantage of that. So there you go. You can actually not even have to worry about explicit sizing for your content. You could set one to shrink, one to auto, or both to auto. They'll take up even width. Let's say we did both cells to auto. They're going to evenly take up the available space. Now the cool thing about that too is it doesn't care how many cells are in your grid X. So I'm going to add 2 more cells in here. You can see that they evenly take up the same amount of space. Now if I set the first one back to shrink, you can see how this responds. So the shrink one will, again, only take up the amount of space of the text inside, and then the auto cells will automatically split the remaining space evenly. This is really powerful and cool. It's going to save you a lot of time and energy setting up your layouts. So from here, we're going to go into some vertical layouts. All right, so you can see that these shrink and auto sizing classes really help speed up your layout creation and really make things a lot easier. Now, one really cool thing about the XY grid that I didn't mention yet was how Flexbox likes to have its containers be the same height by default. This is really cool. You don't need an outside plugin like Equalizer anymore to do something like this. So let's take a look at an example. Instead of the text in this shrink cell, I'm going to put an image. So let's drop an image in there. So I'm going to use a placeholder image, and I'm going to set that to 300 pixels tall and high and wide. So if we do that, you can take a look at the cells. They're all the same height. So what they do is with a flex parent, which is your grid X, your cells want to be the same height by default. This is really powerful. So now we can have the first one be really tall, the second and third one also want to be the same height. And you probably like that, especially with card layouts, callouts, other kind of containers that should be the same height. It really makes a clean type of setup. So we talked about setting up your cells in the X direction. So that's grid-X, grid margin X, things like that. So we can actually go in the vertical direction. So let's go ahead and set something up like that. So we'll take off this padding class, and we'll switch this over to grid Y and grid margin Y. Okay, so now we've turned everything over in a different direction. So using the vertical grid in Foundation's XY grid actually does a really cool thing. So it's going to take your horizontal grid and flip it 90 degrees. So your cells are still stacked on top of each other like they would be, like you would expect, but then we can also turn the entire container over 90 degrees. So now you can actually use Foundation sizing classes responsively based on screen size. So let's take a look at how that works. Now the way that browsers detect horizontal layouts versus vertical layouts is different. So if we were just to set up a generic horizontal container, that would actually be 100% width, and the browser knows how to calculate the content inside based on that. Now when you go vertical, browsers can't read 100% width just out of the box. They need an explicit width, so either a viewport height or an explicit width in pixels or rems, something like that. So what I'm going to do is just add a quick style tag just so you can see. We're going to set an explicit height here. So we're going to do 500 pixels. So I set an explicit height. There we go, 500 pixels. And so now you can see this in play a little bit better. So right now we're using some of these auto and shrink classes on our cells. So what this is going to do is it's going to take the 500 pixel height, and with the cells available, it's going to distribute them evenly. Now let me remove one of the cells so it's a little bit easier to see in this demo. Okay, so again, we're taking our 500 pixel width, our height in this case, and we're splitting the content between 3 cells. The first cell is set to shrink, so it's only going to be as high as the content inside of it. The second and third cells are set to auto, so they're going to take up the remaining space height-wise. This is really cool. So now I'm also going to show you how to do it with the responsive classes. So we could do, let's say, small -2, so 2 cells height on the first one, and then we're going to do small -4. And then we're going to do small -6. Okay, so that's going to add up to 12 columns. Then we're going to do some medium sizes too. So let's go into that. So we'll do medium dash, let's do 4. And then medium -4, and then medium -4. Okay, so if we did this, you can see that right now we're on a medium and larger screen, that each one of the cells is 4 cells high. So it's splitting the height by 33% approximately. So then when we get to a smaller screen, you can see that that's going to responsively change. Now the first cell is too high because we set it to small 2. Right here, small 2, and then small 4, and then small 6. So you can see that the second one is 4 cells high, and then the third one is 6 cells high, so it's even taller. So that's how you can use the responsive sizing classes. You can use the Y grid in Foundation to create vertical layouts as well. This is really powerful to lay out your content. Alright, so as promised, I'm going to show you how to use Foundation's XY grid helper classes to really position your cells where you want them. You're going to use these a lot, so this is really cool. Okay, so I have my grid X set up here, and I'm still using grid margin X to space my cells away from each other. And there's 3 cells in this container. So 2 of them are set to auto. What I'm going to do is actually shrink them down a bit so they don't take up the entire width of the grid X. So let's do that. I'm going to go ahead and use, let's say, small -3. And over here, small -3. Okay, so the first cell is set to shrink, so it's only the width of the content inside of it. And then we have small -3 and small -3. So this shows you that you don't have to absolutely fill your grid X with 12 total cells. You can actually use less and it totally works. So now we're going to horizontally position these where we want. So one of the classes to horizontally position them is for centering them. So let's go ahead and do that. So we have the align-center class. So if we attach that to our grid X, you can see that now our cells are aligned right in the middle. And this is really powerful because it doesn't matter how wide the cells are. it'll just figure out where the center is for all of them. That's really powerful and much harder to do without Flexbox or the XY grid. So the default position is align left, but the class is available in case you need to override it for some reason. And then you can also do align right. And so now that's going to shift everything over to the right. So this is really useful if you were setting up maybe a tertiary nav with some social links, or maybe you had some specific content to push over to the right, like an action bar or something like that. So really powerful horizontal positioning classes that you can use there. But there's actually more. So we can actually control how these things are spaced apart from each other. So we could do align justify. Now this uses the justify content space between property in Flexbox. And so now we've spread our cells apart from each other as far away as they can be. So because there's 3 cells, 2 of them are on the outer edges, the other one is in the middle. If I reduce this down to 2 cells, you could see that they're just going to spread apart from each other. If I add another cell in here, you can see that they're again going to space apart from each other as far as possible. So another thing we can do to that, let's bring it down to 3 cells again, and let's change this from align justify to align spaced. So if we do that, now each cell is going to have equal amount of spacing in between each other. So this is also really powerful for setting up your layouts. Now you can have even spacing around each one of the cells with the align space class. So these are your horizontal spacing classes that you can use with the XY grid. Let's go into some vertical spacing as well. So I'm going to go ahead and leave the align space class just to show you can combine all these classes together. We're going to make one of our cells taller, or actually let's go ahead and make our grid X taller. So I got my demo styles here, so I'm going to go ahead and say grid X, and we'll set a height of maybe like 100 pixels. Okay, great. So we just made our grid X 100 pixels tall. Now you can see with the border of our cells that they're actually going to each be equal height. Now this is something I talked about before, that by default the grid cells, they want to be the same height as each other, which is really, again, powerful and useful. Now you can override this with vertical positioning classes that the XY grid has. So let's go ahead and override that. I want all of these things to be aligned to the top. So we can add the align top class. So I'm combining the align space with align top. I just want to show you can do horizontal positioning as well as vertical positioning together on the same element. So align top will override the need for these cells to all be the same height. And just to show you that, I'm going to go ahead and throw an image in here again. So let's do place hold it, and let's make this one 60 pixels. Okay, so you can see that the cells are not all the same height, but they're all aligned to the top now. So instead of top, I want to align them all to the bottom. I can do that. So now they're all aligned to the bottom. And I can also align them to the middle. Now, because align center is taken for horizontal alignment, then align middle is used for vertical alignment. So here you go. We have different height cells, and now they're all aligned right in the middle of our grid X. So this is really powerful. One class just sets that up for you. Now, one thing you want to be careful of is if you have any inputs or buttons or text that has margin bottom, you want to remove the margin bottom so that way it will vertically align perfectly. So cool, we have these vertical alignment classes that we can add to align all of our cells. You can also align your cells individually. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the parent level alignment there. Let's just quickly align these cells individually. So instead of on the parent there, we're going to go align self, and let's do middle. So what this is going to do is it's going to align the cell itself individually in the middle. And as you guessed it, you can do it with the other ones as well. So you can do align self top, and then we can do align self bottom. Okay, now that's three vertical positionings that you can do specifically on the cells. You can also do align self stretch, which will again stretch it to the entire height of the container it's in. The parent container, in this case grid X, we set that to be 100 pixels tall. So you have some different classes in there to make it like super easy and fast to set up your layouts. This XY grid is really revolutionary. The vertical positioning, the positioning classes, the speed and ease that you could set up your layouts, the complexity that you could build in. There's actually a lot more to this that we teach in our intro class. So that is a place where we go into even more detail than this. Now, I want to close with saying that this XY grid is based on CSS grid. CSS grid is not something that is fully supported in all the browsers, but Flexbox is. And so this XY grid is based on Flexbox, and it uses a lot of concepts that CSS grid does. So it's really powerful. It's going to make you even more awesome. And I'm just really glad that you're getting to use it and learn it now. Alrighty, so now you just mastered the basics of the Foundation XY grid. Now there's a whole lot more to cover with the Foundation XY grid, and we teach that in our Foundation training classes. So not only will you learn advanced features of the XY grid, but you'll also learn the rest of Foundation. It's also the best place to get all your questions answered. So make sure you check out our Foundation training courses. I'm gonna put the link down below. Now, next week, we're going to talk about more advanced features of the Foundation XY grid with the grid frame and a few other pieces. So I don't want you to miss that. Make sure you hit subscribe up above. Every time you hit subscribe, the Yeti gets a new pad of graph paper so they can lay out their XY grids. We're really excited about the next lesson, so we'll see you next week.